Recording now, Albertina, if you will. Thank you. Hello, hola, buenos días. My name is Juan Pablo Guerrero. I am the Network Director of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this seminar. Bienvenidos. We are here to discuss Making Tax Work, a framework for enhancing tax transparency. This compendium was produced by Professors Richard Murphy and Andrew Baker from the University of Sheffield. They provide an analytical framework for assessing tax systems. I believe it is a very useful toolkit for analyzing access to tax information, but it also provides guidance for undertaking a systematic review of the most important characteristics of tax systems. We hope that this framework will assist the GIFT network in calling for a comprehensive discussion on the matter and in producing draft global principles on domestic tax transparency. A survey carried out last year by IBP's Tax Equity Initiative, the team that is with us today, shows that access to relevant information is a common challenge for civil society organizations. The secrecy around tax information, issues on the quality, lack of information on tax incidents, these are frequent barriers impeding civil society organizations to be part of informed debates about tax policies. The COVID-19 adversity makes these obstacles all more unsurmountable. Now, to be clear, colleagues, we are of course aware that several international norms and standards address comparative analysis and tax administrations and regimes, including tax transparency aspects. They are covered. The IMF Fiscal Transparency Code, one of the performance indicators of TADAT, which is devoted to accountability and transparency. Yes, welcome. Please mute your phone, your microphone. I'm Juan Pablo Guerrero, welcome. The other tool, ISORA, the International Survey on Revenue Administration, has an index on public accountability measuring the commitment to making information public. PEFA devotes a number of indicators to the issue, and the OBS of IBP, again, the Open Budget Survey, also applies 25 questions to revenues. There is no doubt that these tools provide a valuable and significant range for a comparative analysis about tax transparency and administration and policy. However, the challenge is that every aspect of taxation, that is policy development, legislation, administration, and the ultimate impacts of tax implementation, all of these aspects require transparency. And this is what our authors try to address with Making Tax Work. This effort has the support of the World Bank. Since 2019, we have been working with the Global Tax Program. Some of our colleagues from the program are here today to improve the understanding of the information that civil society organizations need to be able to work independently on tax policies and to engage in informed dialogues with governments. My gratitude to the World Bank Tax Program team. And again, thank you for being here today. I would like also to express my gratitude to the authors for their investment in this project, their time, their talent. Richard and Andrew, you have produced a very useful document that fits perfectly with the type of knowledge products that the GIFT network likes to share with members and partners. Based on experience and expertise, it is innovative, ambitious, rigorous, resourceful, provocative. A strong reference for discussions we want to have on domestic tax transparency principles. So thank you. So today we have a wonderful panel for the welcoming of the framework. After 15 minutes presentation by the authors, I will invite an excellent group of experts to provide their comments. I will introduce them then. After the respondent time, we will have an open discussion for 30 minutes. And after that, I will be very pleased to ask Chiara Bronchi from the World Bank and Paulo Di Renzo from IBP to close our seminar. So we start with you, Andrew and Richard. Welcome again.
I shall try and share my screen right now. And yeah.
There you go.
Good.
All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. Thanks to Juan Pablo and the team at GIFT for organising this session for us. And thank you all for coming along to participate in an opening discussion about the themes and ideas in the Making Tax Work document. What we're going to do is divide our presentation into two parts. I'll start off by saying something about what we were trying to achieve in Making Tax Work and what motivated the document, and something about the overall composition of the content. Richard will then flag a few areas, but he is going to mainly talk about 10 high-level and fairly generic principles that of tax transparency that we think it's possible to distill from the document. We've had some comments from Anna Custis from the World Bank, and she correctly identified that the document as yet does not have a conclusion. And in part, that is deliberate and intentional. And the principles that Richard is going to speak to are meant to be the as yet unwritten conclusion for this document. We actually think they need to be part of a collective effort, and that several voices need to be reflected in those. So we're hoping that today, the principles, what they should look like, how they could be applied, how useful they could be, how they could be refined, is where the majority of discussion will be. So when we started off doing this work, Richard and I had been writing a few academic papers about how to systematically evaluate tax systems and how we should design frameworks for doing that. And then as we got into discussions with GIFT, we realized that what we'd actually been talking about really was tax transparency, but tax transparency of a slightly different form to that is commonly understood in the multilateral community. So our first intention really in putting together the Making Tax Work document was to try to move beyond the definition of tax transparency that surrounds the OECD's global forum, which is largely tax transparency as information exchange between jurisdictions to limit tax evasion activities as much as anything else. And we wanted to ask the question, what would be useful for civil society groups, for citizen groups, and for a range of stakeholders to know about how national tax systems were performing. So that was our definition of tax transparency, an ongoing process supplying the qualitative and quantitative data a society needs to assess whether its tax system is working for the benefits of its tax authority, governments, and all other stakeholders. That's the concise, abridged definition. There's more in the actual document. So we see tax transparency in that sense very much as a public good supplied by the government and tax authorities. I think we want to flag two things really right at the start of the presentation. We have a strong suspicion and a strong belief that we're going to see a growing demand to systematically evaluate tax systems coming out of the pandemic, particularly to evaluate whether tax systems can meet redistributive objectives, whether they are capable of doing anything to address the growing inequality that the pandemic has in many respects laid bare, but also other policy priorities, particularly associated with green growth and the question of what role tax systems can do in supporting those kinds of things as well. So I'm going to make a bold claim to start off with, which is that no country currently does this kind of systematic evaluation that we have in mind, despite tax systems being the lifeblood of public services in the wider economy. So I'll come on to say a little bit more about that in a minute. So there was one motivating question really behind Making Tax Work, and that was the question of what tools and mechanisms could enhance a range of stakeholders' knowledge and understanding of tax system performance. And that, in many respects, was indeed the central purpose of Making Tax Work, to set out those interrelated pathways that might do that, and would in turn put national policy dialogue on the functioning and performance of tax systems on a much firmer footing. So essentially what Making Tax the work does is identify types of information release that would enable that, and could in turn potentially inform reform pathways, and certainly societal-wide debates about how tax systems should be reformed. So enhancing policy dialogue was really one of the objectives that we were hoping might come out of some of the things in the Making Tax work document. There is one thing I particularly want to flag before we hear from Richard, and that is the importance of qualitative data. That is a pretty regular feature that crops up in several points in Making Tax work. And the kinds of things we had in mind and what motivated us there in thinking about this actually goes back to World Bank assessments of corporate governance systems in an earlier era, when the World Bank published corporate governance ROSCs. And if anybody takes the time to read those, what they'll see is some very clear descriptions and explanations of the actual practices in corporate governance systems, but done systematically in those reports. They're highly intelligible and approachable for a range of stakeholders. And one of the things that I want to emphasize coming out of Making Tax work is we think there's enormous potential and an urgent need to do precisely this kind of thing for tax systems, and that it would be possible and extremely useful. So in very basic terms, Making Tax work identifies 4 types of data that we think, and the document is organized really around these 4 types of data, and they are the basic data, intermediate data, advanced, and aspirational. So before I hand over to Richard, I'll just throw up this table, and very briefly what that shows is that most of the things in Making Tax work do fall into that basic category, and that's fairly rudimentary quantitative data, accounting and economic data. And then we go on to the intermediate category, which are annotations around tax policy and tax strategies. And then we move on to an advanced category. But I want to flag this bottom category because that is where we think a lot of the future potential action is. And that's where we would hope we would see future potential action. And that is where, certainly in terms of tax spillover assessments, that's where the bulk of the qualitative data is. You'll see that in the aspirational category, there's also quantitative calculations of theoretical taxable income that we recommend. Richard's going to say a little bit more about that shortly. One thing I want to flag here is, in relation to the tax spillover assessments, one of the comments we got from Anna Custers was that we weren't talking so much about tax administration and administrative procedures. In actual fact, in the spillover assessment framework, I would estimate that around 1/3 of that data that we're talking about assembling, albeit in qualitative form, is reporting on administration and administrative procedures. So at this point, I will hand over to Richard.
Andrew, thank you. I want to talk about really where we want this work to move to. First of all, the conclusions which we are tentatively putting forward, then where we might go after that. But let's just be clear what Making Tax work tried to do. And it is very much framed within the COVID situation, even down to the fact that I had COVID whilst writing it and got delayed as a consequence. And for those who haven't had COVID, I don't recommend it. We were looking about transparent budgeting. And of course, we all understand the importance of that. We are only building on a framework which Gift and others have worked on there. Consistent and timely tax accounting. And we actually dedicated quite a lot of space in the document to show that actually tax accounting is not that good at present in many countries. And here we are talking developed, not so developed, wherever in the world, we have problems with the accounting for tax, in my opinion. And as an accountant, I have problems with it. As an economist, I do too. So we put forward a tax transparency framework, which is, again, at the core of the document. There's a lot in it, but it basically is suggesting what we hope would form the foundation of a set of documents to let somebody truly and comprehensively appraise what is And that's really important. If we look at the first two steps that Andrew showed on the previous slide, we're talking about the what is in existence with regard to a tax system. What we move to as we go into the final two parts, the advanced and the aspirational, is what is not apparent within the tax system, but is possible if there was the political will or imagination or desire to do something more. And again, we think that this is key now to the discussion. So tax gap analysis, in our opinion, is not the standard three-step process of here's a theoretical tax take, less evasion, less avoidance, less unpaid tax. But we add two more levels to that. The tax that is simply not chosen to be taxed, the tax bases that are excluded. In many countries, wealth, for example, but obviously in other countries, all sorts of things are excluded. And also the cost of tax reliefs and allowances, which are incredibly poorly budgeted for. It's very interesting, the European Union has a requirement that every member state publish the cost of its tax spends in terms of allowances and reliefs each year. And they don't, as far as I can see, or if they do, heaven knows where they are, and I have asked for them. So what we're interested in is this possibility with regard to tax discussion, as well as the simple facts of what has happened, and training people to use that. If I could have the next slide. So where did we come to? This is the conclusion element, if you like, of what we were talking about in the document, and sets the framework, I hope, for the discussion we're going to have. And some very simple statements to start with. Everyone in the country should have access to tax information. Now, you would think that's glaringly obvious, but in my experience, it clearly is not the case that people do have access to that information, let alone in a format that they might understand. Again, it's important that the government publish the objectives for its tax systems, and having looked at this issue across Europe over the last few years, I've been quite heavily involved in studying this as part of a European Union funded project. It is not clear that all countries do by any means publish their objectives for their tax system. We get ad hoc systems that do not necessarily have a lot of principle behind them at all. That needs to be translated into a detailed budget plan. And of course, most countries have a budget. But what I'm talking about is a budget plan that explains why, rather than just what is. Again, what we're looking at in a very big way is what is missing here? What could aid understanding? Consultation on tax changes is a contentious subject. I don't want to spend a long time on it. I know some people think it actually is an impediment to progress, and I can understand that to some extent. What I'm talking about here is the fact that there does clearly need to be communication. And of course, we need to have governments accounting for tax at least once a year. And that is by no means always properly delivered. Andrew, can I have the next slide? This moves on to the more aspirational level. We'd like tax gap analyses, we'd like them annually. They obviously do not happen that way. There is a discussion in the New York Times, I noticed this morning, on the subject of tax gaps and what could be done if only the US would look at this issue. So this is clearly relevant and being discussed right now as an alternative to Biden's stimulus package that's being put forward. And this is the sort of debate we want to fuel, but the US has out-of-date tax gap data. Only the UK tries an annual tax gap analysis, and there are weaknesses in it. There are weaknesses in other aspects of tax, particularly the fact of the relationship with law. I know this only too well in the UK, where there's a lot of discussion about this particular issue right now. And all taxpayers should have access to that law. They should be helped to comply with that law. So there's a focus in here. And this extends, by the way, from top to bottom of the tax system. This extends from the multinational corporation who wants a clearance for what it proposes to do and knows that it will be treated in a certain way as a consequence of its behavior, right down to the individual who wants to know how to pay their tax. Ultimately, though, what we're also looking for is this 10th one, an audit agency who can be responsible for reporting upon that tax system. There does need to be somebody other than the tax authority who marks its own work. It's too common in many tax systems, again, looking at a lot of reviews, including those in the EU, OECD and elsewhere, that it is the tax authority who reports upon its own performance. There does appear to be a need for there to be a third-party agency to do that, to make sure they're held to account for what they're doing. Final slide, Andrew. So, where to next? This is to open the discussion, I hope. This is a draft. I think that's apparent from the document itself. I would certainly want to have another go if we were going to republish it and put it out further and wider. We would clearly welcome feedback at this moment. I think that almost goes without saying, but it's important. We need to add the conclusions we've already mentioned. We're looking for help to resolve those issues. Are those 10 principles the right one? We need to make clear that these suggestions we make fit into the gift principles that already exist on transparency. We're not trying to supplant those or replace them. We're actually trying to integrate into them. And that's particularly where our advanced and aspirational goals play a part in moving beyond, in this case, what has happened to what might happen. But at the end of it, we still think that there's a need for some consistency of approach here to help people to look at how independent, rigorous analysis of tax systems can take place. And the intention of this document was to encourage people in a wide variety of stakeholder situations, from IFOs through to CSOs, to think, could they do this? And we believe that the post-COVID world requires that analysis. That fundamentally is what motivates this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard Murphy, Andrew Baker, for doing your presentation in exact the 15 minutes we agreed on. Amazing. And for allowing us to see you say goodbye to your document and give it to the community to become a document that will be certainly enhanced and enriched by discussion, by analysis, by suggestions. And for that, as I was saying at the beginning, we have an excellent, and to start with that, we have an excellent panel of respondents. We have Marlé van Niekerk and Christopher Axelson from the Economic Tax Analysis Directorate of the National Treasury of South Africa. We're very pleased to have such engaged public servants in tax transparency as part of this meeting. After that, I will introduce my dear friend, Jason Lacking, IBP Senior Research Fellow, an expert on the matter too. He has been working for the last 4 or 5 years on this particular issue. Then we will hear from Wilson Pritchard from the University of Toronto. He's also the chair of the International Center for Tax and Development. And Anna Kosters, who was already mentioned, she and her team already sent some comments. And we will close, as we say in Spanish, in a golden manner, with a representative from a very respected civil society organization based in Uganda, Seatini, Southern and Eastern Africa Trade, Information and Negotiations Institute, Regina Nabuga. Let me go back to our first respondent. Marley, to you.
Muchas gracias, Juan Pablo. I think maybe it helps to understand why we are engaged public servants in matters of tax transparency. 2 years ago in South Africa, we had a commission of inquiry into tax administration to look into the governance of our tax administration. So this is where we're coming from. We know that we need to make our tax system more transparent. Not least, and I think this is a point that is in the paper there already, but I just want to emphasize it because transparency enhances compliance of taxpayers. If people know where the money is coming from, and then I'm a treasury official, how it is being spent, people are more willing to pay. And perhaps it's useful to have 3 categorizations of transparency. There's the policy development process, and all the consultation that go with it. There's tax secrecy itself, and then there is the confidentiality of tax administration itself. And I think that is the last point about having perhaps an audit agency for tax administrative data. Some countries use the National Audit Office, the Supreme Audit Office. Other countries like the US have an inspector general, and in some cases the tax ombuds are used for that. But there's a question: is this so specialized that you need a specific office to do just that? That's a question that we would also be interested in getting views on. I like that there's a multidisciplinary approach here, because we always work with lawyers and accountants. I'm an economist by training, and there are very slight differences in nuance in how an idea like fairness or transparency is viewed by these different disciplines. Following from that, there's a question of what information is needed for tax administration that flows from the policy design itself. So if you have a certain program, you need certain information to understand how much tax people need to pay, or how much the tax system is actually expending. But then there's a question of how high the compliance of burden is to taxpayers in order to give all of that information. So a lot of information is already available in tax administrations. Some of it might be extracted. Some of it might not be used, but it is there, in which case it is actually a burden on taxpayers that counts for nothing. And on that note, I actually think I'm going to hand over to Chris because he's been an innovator in using the tax administrative data better.
I don't know if it's morning or afternoon to everybody, but hi everyone. Thanks very much for the paper and the presentation. I mean, you know, we're in the Treasury here. We actually thought we were doing quite well in terms of tax transparency, but then when I go through all your lists, I suddenly don't have as much hubris anymore. So it's really good to see all of those issues. I think, you know, from our side as a developing country, I mean, we try and publish as much as we can, especially on the revenue side, line items, everything, the tax expenditures, we try to do as much as we can. I think we really struggle with the tax gap. You know, if you chat to, you know, revenue authorities, they're in the business of trying to get revenue. So now to, you know, do like a random audit on personal income tax or CIT to then get a true figure of what the tax gap would be, you know, they just don't have the resources available to do it. So, you know, we struggle to go a little bit further there, and it's trying to convince, I think, both the authorities and the revenue administration that this is worthwhile doing. Also, things like tax spillovers, you know, it's a relatively new concept, and I must say we don't really think about it that way, and we haven't incorporated that thinking in our analysis. So it's nice to see that. The things like the legislation, getting it through, it also raises interesting points about how, you know, the legislation must be through before it's in effect. You know, we don't do that. We announce on the budget it's effective immediately, and then in effect we have a year to get the legislation passed. I don't know if other parliaments are just super on the ball and they get their legislation through really quickly with those things like personal income tax rate changes and excise duty changes and things. We also, to try and speed things up, some of it's in regulation, you know, and then the regulation doesn't need to go through Parliament and the minister can sign, you know, it gets it done really quickly. But is that maybe that is a bad thing? So, you know, we should think about that. The one thing that maybe you could look at, and I don't know how much is dealt with in the paper, maybe I missed it, it's just on taxpayer confidentiality. You know, so we try and be as transparent as possible, but then suddenly when it's pretty obvious that it's this one company that's claiming this huge deduction, you know, can you put it out there? You know, and we have this debate as well that if there are tax expenditures, you know, should we actually just be providing a list that's made public on this is how much they're getting, you know? But then does it undermine taxpayer confidentiality? So we're struggling a little bit with that issue in order to be more transparent. But otherwise, thank you very much. It's great food for thought, and it really does set the bar in terms of what we can do. And it's a very useful project. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chris and Marley, for your input, for your insights, and for your frankness. To Jason Laking now, but before, let me apologize to Alexander Clem, the Deputy Chief of the Tax Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. He's also part of our wonderful list of respondents, and we'll get to you, Alex. Sorry about that. But before, Jason, adelante.
Thanks very much, Juan Pablo, and thanks to Andrew and Richard for what I think is an incredibly useful piece of work. And so I just want to start by recognizing the comprehensiveness of this document and how it really gets us into the weeds of what I think we need to know about taxes, why we need to know it, and also properly centers the kinds of choices governments are making about tax and that the broader public should be involved in. And I really appreciated the emphasis on justification. It was mentioned a little bit in the point about qualitative data, but the importance of governments justifying or explaining why they are taking certain choices, taking certain decisions about tax, I think is essential and something we've been doing some thinking about over the last few years in general around the budget. So I really appreciate all of that, and think that this is a foundation for good conversations about the way forward. I'm going to just make a couple points about areas where I think the document and the approach could be a little bit stronger, and I hope these are constructive. The first is that I think that the hierarchy, which was talked about in the slides, is useful between information which is sort of more minimally needed, moving through what we might think of as good practice, and then onto aspirational information, and that is laid out in the grid in the document. I do think that probably there's a need for the document to spend a little bit more time elucidating the logic of this framework. Why is certain information considered basic? Why is other information considered aspirational? And to spend a little bit more time on some of the basic and intermediate data, which is where most countries actually are, explaining kind of whether the reason that certain information is in certain categories has to do with how easy it is to collect and disseminate or what it's used for. It doesn't come out as clearly as it could, to help us think then about the trajectory that countries are on, where they should be, what kind of, where we should focus reform agendas. I think it would help to flesh that out further, and I could say a bit more about that. I think the document could also be organized a bit differently to bring out this framework more strongly. It comes out more clearly in the presentation than I think it does in the document. The second point is around comprehensiveness, and kind of relates to something that Chris just said, which is that I think the comprehensiveness of this document is a huge asset. It feels like you've really gone and looked at almost everything that one would care about or think about when it comes to revenue. The downside of that is that it can feel like what is being asked of governments and users is too demanding. And I think it would help, again, connected to the previous point, if we strengthen the kind of trajectory and explanation of how governments might move from basic to more aspirational, it would also help to provide some intermediate steps that governments might take that are less demanding. And so, for example, I think there's a point where you talk about assessing tax types by their contributions to different values, such as the 5 R's. And you kind of suggest that we could look at all taxes in this way and then have a simple weighting system and then be able to do an analysis of that. And I think that vastly oversimplifies how complicated this is, given that these are incommensurate values, even across the 5 R's. There are different things that we're trying to achieve. It's not that easy to compare them. Similarly, I think there's a bit of a way in which you look down upon marginal analysis and sort of put a lot of emphasis on we need to look at the whole tax system and how the whole tax system contributes to the values that we have. I think that's a nice idea. I think it's unrealistic in many cases. I think marginal analysis matters when we're thinking about a particular reform and the way that reforms actually happen. It's a particular reform at a particular time, and we should be asking, is it contributing to our values or not? Of course, we want to move towards more systematic analysis, but I think we should also give a role for marginal analysis as something that's, I think, more realistic in many cases for countries to do. Not to undermine your point that coming out of COVID, maybe there's an opportunity to push for some more systematic analysis, but also recognizing that this is there's just a limit to how far this is going to go in many countries. Final point I want to make is on politics. You bring politics into the document. These days, everybody has to say something about politics, political economy, political will, etc. And I think that's, of course, valuable as a political scientist. I certainly value it. But I also think that there is a sense in which the way in which you talk about politics in the document is a little bit unclear, and it's worth a discussion about whether or not there's some value in first laying out the framework in a more quote unquote apolitical way, and then bringing it into a conversation with the politics rather than trying to weave politics into the different pieces of it, which I found to be to leave us a little bit short in terms of what how these politics actually work, what we mean by politics, and what we mean by the political economy of tax. So I think it's important, but perhaps some thinking about how to organize that conversation. So I'll stop there just to say again, I think this is an incredibly useful first step, much more than a first step, first many steps in taking us down the road of defining what we mean by tax transparency. And I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Jason. Let me ask now Anna Costers. I see Royal Dom is here with us, and I wonder if Wilson is too, but you lead us, Anna, on your team reactions, please.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and many thanks to Gift and Richard and Andrew for putting this very substantial piece together and for organizing today's discussion. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody and to discuss this very exciting paper. So maybe it's helpful to place this a little bit in the broader context in which this work also contributes to the broader engagement that we have ongoing at the World Bank, where we have this work that we refer to as innovations in tax compliance, where we try to make explicit, in particular, the role of trust and trust building that governments can engage in with citizens in order to improve tax compliance. In that context, this work is extremely helpful because it will provide a primary source material for tax transparency and also provide the rationale for why this is important to look at. What is particularly great about the work is that it provides some very concrete handles to work with in order to start building trust with taxpayers or to enhance that process. And that's really very valuable from where we come from. We often get these questions from governments, and then well, you know, it's good that we start defining concrete pathways for working on this. I think interesting in particular is that when you think about tax transparency, it ultimately sort of asks the question, how can we build a fairer tax system? That's what this is about. How can we think about how do we engage with the formal tax system in one way to build a fairer tax system? At the same time, one thing that might be interesting to elaborate on as well, or to explore a little bit, is how does this formal tax system interact with informal taxation? So one thing that we have come across quite a bit in our work is that, in particular, when thinking about tax burdens on the poor, of course, they often fall into the informal economy, perhaps not carrying such a heavy formal tax burden, but they're for sure are a lot of taxes that they do pay. It may not be formally to the government, but to other stakeholders in society. And so thinking about tax transparency with it, which in the end sort of focuses on making the system more, like the tax system, fairer. We often tend to focus on the larger companies. How much do they pay? The wealthy individuals, how much do they pay their fair share? How can we relay this vis-a-vis the oftentimes quite significant tax burdens that perhaps the poor also face? And there you get into that discussion in terms of qualitative information. That type of information won't be easily available from the government as such. But I think it is a challenge for the community to think about how can we actually also build up our knowledge and information in terms of what that true tax burden of the poor is, because we'll actually we know something about it, but I don't think we yet know enough about that. So let me stop there and then see if Roel wants to add in a few more remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Let me start by echoing what a lot of the other discussants have already mentioned, that this is a great piece of work and this is a very welcome addition to the literature, I think. Also coming at this from the same project that Anna described, innovation and tax compliance work, where we are looking at the role of trust in voluntary and quasi and enforced compliance. I think this is a great addition. I think we will be drawing on this quite a lot in our upcoming work. Maybe when I was going through the document, I was wondering, or I was coming at it from the perspective of business taxation and businesses. And I was sort of wondering how this would apply to improving quasi-voluntary compliance and compliance in general among businesses. Because that's something in our own work in innovations in tax compliance, when we start thinking about quasi-voluntary compliance, what does that mean for businesses? It's mentioned here and there, but what I was sort of missing in the discussion was an application to how this transparency would benefit businesses, or how it would be applied to that taxpayer segment. And I think that brings me to the second point, which we already shared with you in some comments earlier, is this idea of budget transparency versus procedural transparency. Now, in this document, there's a clear link with literature on budget transparency, but I was wondering if there's not an opportunity to engage a bit more with issues around procedural transparency as well, because I think there's a good opportunity there to draw clearer links with business tax compliance and business tax morale going forward. So that may be something as an addition for future work, or it may be something that you could reflect on in this version. But I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on this in the discussion. Thanks, and I'll hand it back over to Juan Pablo.
Thank you, Roel and Anna, very much for your comments. We now go all the way to Uganda, where we have Regina Navuga from Siatini sharing her comments. Welcome, Regina.
Thank you, and thank you, Richard and Andrew, for the presentation. It's just to note that I think for those who don't know Siatini is a sub-regional organization that works on issues of trade, investment, and fiscal policies, ensuring that they work for the people, both at subnational, national, regional, and international level. And for us, we note that this study is going to complement our work, since every day we engage with government, both at subnational and regional level. But what's key to note is the fact that information is power at the end of the day. If you don't have data, quality data, everything is a mess. We know garbage in, garbage out. If government does not get the right data, that means even the whole process will be mad. We note that if civil society does not have the right information, we cannot influence effectively in all the different aspects that we're talking about. I do like some of the recommendations or highlights that have been made in the study. That tax transparency is a process, ideally, and it gives the foundation of why we tax, what should we expect, and the role of government in ensuring that they put in place a good tax system. Then, of course, we do note that and agree with the study that we have different contexts and we need to come up with different strategies. You know, it's not a one size fits all, be that at national level and subnational level. Then the fact that tax incentives are generally awarded, and of course we know that there's a lot of opaqueness when it comes to that. CETIN has done a lot of work around influencing double taxation agreements, issues around tax incentives, and then for us this study comes in handy for us to understand what government thinks when they are coming up with such tax policies sometimes. And you might even be surprised that sometimes they enact some of these tax policies without going through this research, you know. Sometimes we've had instances in Uganda where they just come up with tax policies without having enough evidence that is backed in the different proposals. We do also note that it's also important for governments to have different access to information, both national, regional. And for us, we know that in Uganda, we do not have a beneficial ownership registry, which has been alluded to in the study, which is of course absurd. But of course, some of the general comments I have from my end is we need to look at tax transparency holistically. We are focusing on government, which is a good thing, but we need to understand also the stakeholders, especially I think the private sector. It needs to come out in the study. They have different needs. Some of them is to dodge taxes, some of them to understand what the tax is, and then come up with different strategies on how to ensure that maybe they are dodging taxes. Then for, of course, the taxpayers, they need to understand that when they pay taxes, there's something good that is going to come out of it. The study notes that citizens need to understand the importance of paying taxes, but I think it's good for us to show that government is making a commitment to address some of the critical social service, provide some of the critical social services like education, health, not just putting up infrastructure in our context in Uganda. Then the other issues about tax compliance. We know that taxpayers might be availed with necessary information, but some of them still go ahead. Some of them will still go ahead to dodge paying taxes. The study needs to understand the underlying issues or factors that lead to this, and why countries maybe continue giving tax incentives in the long run. The study, I think, also needs to come up with a framework on how citizens can engage on tax policy, both at subnational and national level. Of course, I did note that the study also noted that there's a top-bottom approach. Sometimes in Uganda, like in developing countries, sometimes governments first come up with medium-term expenditure frameworks before they even know where the revenue is coming from, which is, yet the study highlights a different thing that you have to first know your revenue, then you work backwards, which is not the case in some contexts. Then I think the other issue is about, if you thought about the whistleblowing in tax transparency, the whistleblower policy, how do we try to ensure that some of these issues are brought on board? Then maybe the last one is to broadly try to understand, and I think someone also alluded to it, is what do you share? What do we expect the government to share at the end of the day? Issues around confidentiality, you know? Yet here we expect the government to share everything, which is not the issue. Issues around capacity building when it comes to government officials, civil society organizations, to put all these, the government in check. So broadly, that's what I had to share.
Magnifico. Thank you so much, Regina. Very useful comments from a much needed perspective. Thank you. Now, Dr. Alex Clem, to you, colleague. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here. I really enjoyed reading through this really nice and long document. So congratulations on that. Obviously, tax transparency and fiscal transparency more generally is a really important topic for the IMF. And I think Juan Pablo already mentioned at the very beginning the Fiscal Transparency Code, which is not even the first document in this area that we have published. This is something that is of utmost importance. Regarding taxes, specifically, this code mentions tax expenditures as an important issue, so I was glad to see them picked up. And resource taxation, which I know there are other initiatives on that specifically, because that's a particularly murky area in many countries, but that's also very important. Another thing we do at the IMF is we publish a world database of revenues, and how this links to this is that it's so difficult to put together this database. So even for an institution like the IMF that has really more access than the average person, it's not easy to collect comparable data on revenues for so many countries. So we do it and we put it together, but it could certainly be better. The quality of the data would be better if the source data were better and more easily accessible. I think the timing of this report is exactly right. So now, after the pandemic, we will have to build up tax systems. Many countries will have to raise taxes. They may have to raise taxes in periods where the economy is weak. So it will be politically and economically difficult. And then it is particularly important that people understand why and what and whether it's really necessary. So in that sense, you have really got the right timing. There's a lot of research also done by some of the people here in the room that tax increases are more palatable if they are well understood. So tax transparency will absolutely help in that regard. I myself have done some research showing that people are quite supportive of the tax increase to cover the cost of the pandemic, provided they are being told what it is for. And provided they believe it. And of course, for them to believe it in the long run, actually, it has to be used also for the purpose that it's going to be used for. But let me now come back to the report. What I really liked about it is that it came up with this ranking of priorities of different degrees of tax transparency, right? So the report had basic, intermediate, advanced, and aspirational. I thought that was great, and indeed, even the basic is missing in many places. Where I would like to raise maybe it would be worth going a bit more into is, while you have this prioritization, it doesn't seem to discuss very much the issue of distinguishing between objective data and of calculated figures that include some degree of judgment or that are more subjective. So there I'm thinking about spillover analysis or tax gaps. This is not to say that I wouldn't want these things to be published. I think it's great to put them into these aspirations. But if I were looking at a country and somebody told me, oh, the tax gap is X%, that wouldn't tell me very much, and I wouldn't even know whether to believe it. So I would say the first priority would be to have the basics out there, the revenues, and the things that you need to calculate something like a tax gap. Because in that case, also, as an observer, I would be able to figure out whether the tax gap figure reported made any sense, whether the methodology agreed with my priors, and I would be in the position to calculate my own tax gap and compare it. So there I would think it's not about not only about what data are more important than others, it's also about what are kind of the objective data that you need to have to put out first to allow people to understand it, and what is kind of the additional and more judgmental one, and how do you indicate this in the data? So how can you be open about that some figures are more subjective, and how can you be as transparent as possible about the method used to calculate them? Yeah, so this is my main question. I'd be really curious to hear a reaction on that. But as I said, it's a really important initiative. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy that you have made progress on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Representing the IMF elite steward of the GIFT network. So we are very grateful for your comments and also for taking the time. As all of you, not only Alex, we know are very, very busy. And now the floor is open. The best part of the exchange comes because I'm inviting everyone who has a comment to share it with us and to express their inputs and feedback to this important document. And of course, I will leave 10 minutes at least to our authors to respond. And since the floor is open, they can also take the floor whenever they want. But just to make sure that I am pushing some of our shy colleagues around the table, let me first allow the participants who haven't spoken to take the floor. Anyone? Hector from Mexico, Andre? Anders, anyone? Hector, adelante.
Just one question.
Yes,
thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I think this is an excellent presentation. I wonder
if for the rest,
if the authors could talk a little bit about the choice, the audience, the importance of audience. So if we talk about transparency, it's in order for people to improve their decision making. So that depends on whether I'm a normal citizen, educated or not educated. Am I a politician? Am I a journalist? Am I in a professional association? Am I a tax expert? So I think implicitly it has been transparency to help tax experts in civil society, but it's a broader range, and the people's access to information is different, the capacity to process information is different, and the kind of interest they have is different. So I would like to hear what are the thoughts on a more audience-based approach to transparency.
Anders, just for those who don't know you, could you tell us your institution?
Sorry, Juan. I work in the World Bank's Fiscal Policy and Sustainable Growth Unit with tax and digital technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Hector.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. It's a very outstanding document and certainly a wonderful road for what's coming in the next months and in the next years. I would like to take 2 points very briefly. I believe that something that is wonderful about the document is this idea that it's not a tax system per se. You need to have objectives, and it's something that we need to work a lot. Second, I like it very much, Regina's point about we need better information, especially administrative information, if we want to do like sound analysis, and I'm looking forward for the continuation of these efforts. Thank you.
Hector, could you tell us your institution and Mexico, the country? That I can
Sure. I'm from Mexico. I'm the executive director of CIEP. It's a think tank specialized in public finance, and I work for Tec de Monterrey as a research professor.
Gracias. Anyone else? So the very awaited moment, Andrew and Richard, to you, my colleagues. Go ahead.
I noticed Andrew was still muted, so I've jumped in first. Look, thank you so much for those comments. They are incredibly helpful, including the criticisms. In fact, I think a lot of those are justified. I mean, Anna, I just like the fact that actually you point out that I've sort of overlooked, and I think I'm responsible for this, the corporate element of this, and that's because I've worked around sort of tax transparency issues now for 18 years and spent so long working on corporate tax transparency, I probably actually overlooked it here to a degree because I think, oh, that's covered by something I've already done, and it shouldn't have been, because it is critical. I would really welcome the points Tina, oh no, sorry, was made from,
Regina.
made about the fact there's an absence of a beneficial ownership register in Uganda, because one of the things that we've drawn out in the work is this importance of interacting systems, in particular around tax and other aspects of administration, particularly accounting enforcement, the need for information. In so many countries in the world, corporations are a mechanism not only for providing the opportunity for the private sector to deliver, and I believe very strongly in that. You know, please don't get me wrong, I'm a chartered accountant. I've been a director of many companies in my career, and I'm entirely happy and, you know, at ease with that and the profit motive. But equally, they can be used to subvert the tax system so easily, as we know, as can trusts. And so there is this conflict which we need to resolve, and I don't think we did pull that out enough. So I think that's an incredibly important point, that we need to find that right balance. I happen to believe, and I believed this when I was in practice as an accountant, that a strong tax administration who was fair to all companies and required the information to be supplied was actually intensely pro-business. That he actually provided the level playing field, which as an economist, you know, we teach, you know, economics 101, the level playing field and open data, and yet it doesn't exist, and we know it doesn't exist. So I believe there's a really strong element there I need to bring out in this. I loved the fact you many people brought out the confidentiality issue. I don't think we focused on that enough. I liked the whistleblower element in that, and again, I liked the comment which I think it was Chris made from South Africa about the problem of disclosing certain tax expenditures because they are so obviously related to particular companies and the conflicts that that can give. And I think that's an issue that we will certainly need to look at. I don't actually see that at the end of the day as an impediment to progress. This is a problem that has come up many times in international trade. There's a notorious footnote in UK history that we had a terrible balance of trade a couple of months once before a general election because our airline bought some Boeing 747s right at the time they were being introduced, and that created massive problems for the balance of trade at that time. Well, these things need to be, in fact, addressed openly rather than hidden in many cases, and where the subsidies are needs to be talked about. So I think there's a big issue in there. The audience question, Anders, I liked that one too, and then I'm going to stop. Audience here is actually in part, and again, perhaps I have, you know, would not been explicit enough. Again, I've spent many years talking to people. I think politicians are a major audience for this. The level of tax knowledge amongst most politicians is very low. I have spent many, many hours inside parliaments, mainly in Europe, not all, but mainly in Europe, talking to people, explaining how tax systems work and what they do, and even the most basic elements of tax. So I think they're critical. Journalists don't understand tax. The number of people I've had to explain that corporation tax is a tax on profits and that is not revenue is just ridiculous. And we have to have that basic sort of information because it's so rare that people understand this. It's too easy, as you say, to presume this is just for tax experts and a very small group in civil society. Broader civil society needs to understand this, particularly given the changes in society we're going to see around COVID, and also green issues, where green taxation is going to be a major part of any transition we make, which I think is going to need to be understood. So an audience to understand that is vital, and how tax authorities learn to communicate it, I think, is key. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass over to Andrew for his comments now, but I really enjoyed those comments. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go through a few things that occur to me. I'll just pick up on something Chris Axelson said about South Africa. We looked at some of the links that were sent through on South Africa, and by our reckoning, South Africa was performing rather well on 3 of the 4 data types. Less well on tax gaps, obviously, but nobody's doing those, as we've already indicated. But actually, we thought that actually, as we went through them and looked at the documents, South Africa was ticking them all off and is kind of pretty doing very well on tax transparency. So I wanted to flag that because you said that you had less hubris, and I think Richard and I's view when we consulted on this was South Africa had done rather well, actually, according to our schema anyway. I agreed with virtually everything Jason Lakin said. Unfortunately, I wish I could suggest otherwise, but I think he was spot on in everything in terms of they were very useful and helpful comments in terms of just adjusting the organization of the document slightly and maybe switching the emphasis. I think you're right to draw out that hierarchy more strongly. I think you're right that we need to have some discussion of whether or not some of these standards are too demanding and how you move from one level of compliance to another level, and how you move towards the aspirational and what the routes for that are. I think that was all excellent. And I basically agreed with it. Also, I think you're right on the point about the politics is probably too integrated into the document as it currently stands. I think I agree with that. The 5 R's point as well, I hadn't realized that was as prominent as it was actually. So thanks for flagging that. And I think you're right about that as well, I have to say. I think Richard dealt with Roll's point about business and the dangers of quasi and mock compliance and trying to expose that. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's another thing that we could certainly draw out more fully. So I mean, we're getting lots here to tell us how to refine this document. And Regina's comment, what I took from what Regina said was that she's given us a lot more work to do actually, because she's told us effectively that we need to write an extra chapter in this document, which is a chapter on how citizens can engage on tax policy and the mechanisms and methods for doing that. And included in that should be a section on whistleblower policy. So I think that what you've identified and put your finger on there is a missing chapter. And I think that that's, but I think that would be quite easy to do and put right. Alex Clem's comments, again, absolutely, I think you're absolutely right. And what I took from those is the main point about transparency around methods, especially in the aspirational categories. We weren't as explicit about that in the presentation today. I think we could talk more about the methods associated with that. We've kind of held back on that because we didn't want to, in the Making Tax Work document, we didn't want to go into those technical issues so much. We have invented a methodology for spillovers, and Richard has one for tax gaps, but they are ongoing live experimental projects that are continuously open to refinement, as these things always are. And you're quite right to point out that discretionary judgments, in a sense, play a role. I mean, the model we used for the spillover methodology is, as I indicated in the presentation, is something that comes out of some prior work by the World Bank and the administration of a range of kind of qualitative methods supplemented with some quantitative data. So what we've ended up with in spillover analysis is a kind of scoring system, a riskometer for identifying risks and vulnerabilities within tax systems. We can talk more about that at a later date if people are interested. We're certainly not implying that is the finished definitive kind of way of doing that, but it's a starting point for getting us somewhere to how we might do spillovers. The Anders point on audience, I mean, we as with Anna's comment on trust, we had 2 slides on that, but Richard quite rightly made me take them out of the presentation because it would have been too long and unwieldy. But I did speak to those points on audience and trust, because that is exactly how we see this in a way, which is about how you grow trust in the tax system and how you grow kind of multiple mutual stakeholder dialogues around the tax system, and it just can't happen without information. But this comes to the Anders point, which is that information also has to be intelligible. So it's no good in having just having numerical charts. If this is to be used by wider consumer by a range of civil society groups, and I'm not going to list them all, but you can imagine. Then the information has to be clearly written. It has to be intelligible. It has to be written in kind of clear, explanatory language. And actually, when the World Bank did those corporate governance reports, it was remarkable how intelligible that information was in those reports. I basically, yeah, I mean, Hector's right that in a way, one of the things we wanted to flag up really very clearly in the document is the importance of transparency around objectives and being able to assess objectives, which was, was a major driver behind the document. But I mean, they're a fantastic set of comments, and it's given us pause for thought. And basically, we've got at least 10 ways we can now improve this document, and that's what we're taking away from today.
Thank you for a generous response. Let me ask if there is any other comment or question. We've been doing great with the timing of this very fruitful discussion. Anyone else? I'm looking, well, I'm very pleased. Yeah, we have to so Andre Brome, introduce yourself and please take the floor. And then we go to that random. Thank you.
Andre Brome from University of Warwick. This question, I enjoyed reading the report. It was in a way more detailed and lengthier than anticipated. It's a good thing. About the independent function, Andrew and Richard, and if you say a little more about what you might look in the document, you raised the idea of having an independent government agency or the party. Do you have any views from your research about what may be preferable in terms of the idea of practice, or is it a function that should perhaps be lifted up and taken on by an international organization, part of the IMF's work with Article 4 consultations, part of the World Bank's work? What's your view about how the auditing could be expanded to underpin these kinds of reforms to fiscal systems? Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. I see Marley has also her hand raised. We'll come to you, Marley. Dadam Randam, all the way from Indonesia. Thank you, my friend.
Okay, thank you, Juan Pablo. Thank you for all amazing presentation for Andrew Becker, Richard Marby, and others. Me, Dadan Ramdan from Initiative, one of NGOs from Indonesia, focus in tax transparency, tax equity in Indonesia. I will show us last 3 years, Initiative conduct School of Budget Politics. Budget politics for revenue from natural resources, and we conduct it, involve grassroots, involve community for enhance, ensure community could advocate for more tax transparency. And I think tax transparency very urgent, involve grassroots or community or taxpayer. With that involve community, I think it not meaningful for citizens, for people. Okay, I will ask for all, for Andrew Becker and all, how your opinion about tax transparency in South Asia, like Indonesia. We need information for outside, from global, organization, from global organization to look how tax transparency in South Asia. like Indonesia. Thank you. Thank you, Juan Pablo.
Thank you, Darren. Marley?
Thank you for giving me another chance. I think the two things that maybe stood out for me in this discussion, since the presentation, is maybe, and maybe that comes from my own experience, just I've worked on direct taxes, but I think transparency in indirect taxes is actually fiendishly difficult to track. Just because the administrative apparatus around it doesn't give you a clear indication of where the incidence lies. So I think for future work and for this whole group, maybe that's the challenge, how we would even tackle that. But there are important links there to, well, some of the experiments that are being done with electronic fiscal devices, whether they can help to make it more transparent, but that brings a whole different problem about the potential abuse of tax information. So that would be interesting future work. And then just something that Regina said sparked an idea of something that we talked about previously, about tax and language. So there's legal language, that's already its own thing, and tax technical language, I'm just an economist. I don't understand half of it, perhaps. But in a country like South Africa, where we have 11 official languages, there's an automatic language barrier that's already there. And then for tax technical language, there is an extra barrier for any transparency initiative. Thanks.
Thank you. The last, and I'll ask you, Rizky Estrada, to be very, very brief on your question, if you please. Go ahead, Rizky Estrada, again from Indonesia, in the middle of the night there.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the presentation. I think that point also giving our guidelines about the 10 principles that you shared to us. But in base our practices, we need to considering about the context, about the regulation context, about this, the tax systems. Because in case in Indonesia, we have a different scheme of tax that each governments from central, subnational until the regional, they have the authority to collect some kind of taxes or another name like retributions for the in the public sector. So that is the first one. The second thing is I'm agree with Marley. I think for right now during the COVID, all the government, they are developing some the digital platforms about how to collecting tax more easy for the taxpayers. But the problem is it's hard for us, for NGO, for the grassroots organization like us to access about that information, because that is like channels that are still connecting between the taxpayer with the institution who have authority to collecting the tax, but they not giving the public information how many target that they have collecting from the taxpayers. I think that's 2 points that we need to considering about the context about the tax system for each countries, maybe in Africa and also in Indonesia, because Indonesia have a decentralization system, so that also applying with such of the tax systems. So we have a 3 type of mechanism. The nationals have authority to collect what kind of tax, and also in the subnational, for example, in provincial, they all only have the authority to collect a 5 item of tax. And in the regional level, they have authority to collect, for example, this 11 part of tax they able to collect. I think so that is the point. But the point is, I'm agree and thank you so much about to giving about the picture how we are trying to assess about is that our system is transparent or not. So this is make easy for us to as a tools to make a preliminary assess about the tax system in our country. I think that's all. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you, Risky. Good to see you. Half a minute, Andrew, and half a minute, Richard, and then we go to the closing, please. Just to acknowledge, yes, go ahead.
So from what I could gather from Andre's question, from when he wasn't sounding like a Dalek, the question was about whether or not what role we saw for international organizations in pushing some of this further stuff forward. That leads me on to a big question that I just wanted to throw open to everybody and would hope everyone would take away with them, which is, do we need principles of tax transparency to sit alongside the principles of budgetary transparency that already exist, that GIF drew up, I think about 4 or 5 years ago now? Is that right, Juan Pablo?
Almost 10, yeah.
So do we need a separate or a complementary set of principles of tax transparency? My sense is, from having done this work, that they would be useful. But that raises a further question, which is then how do we get them from here? And that's a question for all of you, I think, and for GIFT and IBP, because they were developed with IBP, and we'd be happy to be involved in the conversation around that, certainly. And the other thing was that when we were devising the spillover assessment framework, we did have in mind that this was something that might sit rather well with an organization like the World Bank, because they have done these more qualitative forms of assessment, and it is not a methodology that is unfamiliar to the culture of the institution, basically. So that's what we were thinking of in relation to that, and it did fit with some of the past history, and we designed it with one eye on that, and that was in part deliberate. Just a final word on audiences, because I didn't say this before. Something like spillover assessment, I think, one of the primary audiences for that, governments themselves. I mean, I didn't emphasize that clearly enough, because the amount of information a government would glean from that exercise is enormous, and that includes revenue agencies. Because one of the things that came out when Richard and I did an 80-page spillover assessment for the UK, systematically went through all the categories we created and wrote down the kind of impressions and detailed it all out. One of the things that came out was that there was a need to provide more resources for revenue agencies. So revenue agencies would find spillover assessments incredibly useful, because inevitably one of the things that comes out is revenue agencies are understaffed and under-resourced, and they deserve a bit more in terms of resource, and that will pay for itself many times over.
Can I make one brief comment really on the audit? I'll have to leave the rest aside, because I know we've got time pressure. I do think there is a real role here for international organizations. I mean, there clearly are some situations where they need to lead this process and guide where standards might go. That doesn't mean to say I think there also isn't a role for a national organization as well. There are some countries where clearly there are national audit officers who do stand independent, who appear to be beyond reach of corruption. And I'm well aware of the risk of corruption in all of these processes, but I think there are. I mean, I would use the UK as an example. Actually, I think South Africa is doing very well on this with your Auditor General. So there are places where there are things which are working with regard to audit, but there are also, and I mean, I heard very clearly the call, for external help in the case of Indonesia, and that there's needed for information. And there are models here. What the right model is open to question. Is that the peer review process, which is, for example, what happens in the OECD on tax, which has its own risks within the system, because some countries defend their own status quo? Or is that something like, as Andrew's just mentioned, our thought that this may be a World Bank related project, perhaps simply because of that previous type of experience in this area? I don't know, but audit to me seems critical, and it's an issue where further discussion is needed, and I'd welcome it.
Thank you very much. And we will certainly continue this conversation. But first we need to finish it, yes?
You have a response to my question about whether we need principles of tax transparency.
Yes. Absolutely. This is what has motivated this effort. So we will continue speaking and working on this. And you were alluding to international financial institutions. Let me, I'm very pleased to introduce Chiara Bronchi, World Bank Manager for Macro Fiscal Department. She heads the Global Tax team, among other teams. So Chiara and Paolo Di Renzo from IBP Tax Equity Team will conclude the seminar. Chiara, welcome, bienvenida.
Gracias, Juan Pablo, and thank you everybody, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all the colleagues. And yes, closing remarks, it's always an interesting task. I'm not summarizing the entire conversation, but I'd just like to pick up on Andrew and Richard's invitation to, step up the role of international organizations, and certainly the World Bank, and promoting also tax transparency. I think we should have principles. I never understood how we can assess the credibility of a budget process without transparency in revenues. And having worked many, many years in this area, I think it would be important to complement on one hand. And the other hand, auditing role, I agree. Most of the countries that we work in, just to conclude, but also because I'm sharing a piece of experience here, of direct experience, do know how much they collect. They don't know how much they should have collected. So, and that does feed into macro fiscal. Is not just about budget. It's also a whole picture of, macro fiscal sustainability, not having to look for other sources of revenues when already there are some, and issues of clearly also trust between citizens and government. And so I think these discussions, I was really impressed, first of all, to see the dynamic. I just had a quick exchange with Juan Pablo on this of today's seminar. I thought it was a very nice way to present the issue and a very nice interaction. I want to also raise a couple of things before I thank everyone. I think one of the conclusions today, or at least my takeaway, apart from the 2 points I've just made, is that we need to really place tax transparency in the same way actually we put public finances transparency, not as a name in itself, but what are the objectives. And I think the whole purpose also of this effort that the World Bank is leading, thanks to Anna, Ho, and also now enjoying with GIFT and others on the umbrella project, which is innovation in tax compliance, is really the focus is to promote trust between government, citizens, and governments, and ideally, eventually, is to deliver services. And so all these dimensions are extremely important. And I think in this spirit, I want to encourage all participants to take into consideration the recommendations coming out today. Thank Richard and Andrew for being with us and sharing their paper, but also I would suggest that rather than enlarging the paper is to now address some of the issues raised in other notes, which we could also see how we can work together on. And thank also GIFT, and again, congratulations to everyone. I look forward to see more of these discussions, and eventually also discussing the how-to, which is what we find most challenging when it comes to advising countries, and especially countries with weak governance environments and low capacity. And that's how, it becomes really challenging to translate this conversation into a reality and then into outcomes. But thank you all for today's participation and for very interesting conversation and exchange. And over to you, Juan Pablo. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara, for making the time and for providing generous comments and clear ways forward. This is very useful. Paulo, broche de oro.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I'm going to try to be very brief. We're already running over time. Chiara gave the bigger picture about next steps. I'm going to focus on at least a couple of points that stayed with me in terms of the actual report and how to maybe proceed towards finalizing it and making it as useful as possible based on many of the comments that were provided. And I think they focus around three dichotomies, if you wish. So the first one is that between comprehensiveness and targeting, whether you want a 191-page report that covers the whole gamut of the issues that fall under the very broad heading of tax transparency, or whether you want a product or a series of products, Chiara was also alluding to some of this, that are more targeted to different audiences and stakeholders that that better show the relevance of the content of this piece of work for different types of actors, which of course you allude to in the report, but which maybe could be brought out more explicitly or utilized for different types of conversations and purposes. The second one is that dichotomy between encouragement versus discouragement. So it's very easy when you talk about, you know, a high level set of principles and practices that go all the way to the aspirational to turn off those that are still stuck with struggling with the basics. So how do you, and this links back to something that mostly Jason said, but was addressed by other people as well, where basically, how do you turn this into something that can motivate even those who are struggling with the basics, rather than make them say, oh, well, you know, if we cannot do a tax gap analysis, then why bother with anything else? And I think that is a challenge that, especially given the audience that this product and these principles will want to the coverage and the breadth of the target audiences, then it's very important, I think, to make sure that those who are stuck with the basics find something in there that motivates them to take action. And the final point is that the dichotomy between availability of information and use of information, or expressed in other ways, between promoting transparency or promoting accountability. And here I thought it was very interesting that the 2 points in the 2 principles that are not really covered in the report are the one about consultations and links back to Regina's point about citizen engagement, and the one about independent verification and audit. So number 4 and number 10, which are the 2 that are really about accountability rather than the disclosure of information per se. And I think in many ways that I'll tell you what I think, but my sense is that it might be shared, that what we really want at the end is something that is more targeted, that is more encouraging, and that is more it pays more attention to the accountability side of transparency. So that's kind of my quick summary of things that I've heard that have resonated with me. I'll join everybody else in saying this was a terrific piece of work, which I think, again, is going to feed into very useful discussions going forward. So thanks to you, Andrew and Richard, and to everybody else who was part of the discussion. Back to you, Juan Pablo.
Thank you very much, Paulo and Chiara, for closing this very good seminar in such an encouraging and committed way. So to be continued, dear colleagues, thank you to our authors. Thank you for their openness and their great sense of attention and perception to all of these very significant, relevant critiques, suggestions, and ways forward. So we take it from here. We will call you back soon with good news. For now, have a great day, great evening. Take care of yourself, keep safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.